Hello, everybody. I'm Marcos Melissus. Welcome to this week's edition of Daily Kos The Brief. It's our weekly show about politics. Today, I am running solo. Carrie's taking some well-deserved time off. It is summertime, so we're gonna be back and forth. Either guest host or running solo through the summer. So it is Carrie's turn to take some time off. Today, we're going to be talking about the gun epidemic in this country, and there's no need to wait. I'm going to bring on today's guest. He is Igor Volsky. He is the executive director of Guns Down America. He's one of the most passionate gun control advocates that I have ever met or had the pleasure of working with in my years in politics. He is also the author of the book, Guns Down, How to Defeat the NRA and Build a Safer Future with Fewer Guns. Igor, first of all, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for that descriptor of passionate. You know, some people say too passionate, but I like that is a plus for you.
So Igor, let me just start really quickly. This topic it's heavy. It's hard. And I'm gonna admit that with the Buffalo shootings and the Uvalde shootings, I can't read all the stories. It's too much. It's overwhelming. This is your world. How do you do it? How do you deal with that grief and that tragedy and you make this very clear. This is not a one-time event or a rare event. This is weekly, daily almost.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you asking that. You know, for a long time, I really avoided working on this issue, thinking about this issue. And you'll remember before the Newtown shooting in December of 2012, Democrats didn't really talk about guns. There was no gun policy. You know, I, at the time, worked at the Center for American Progress, and we had nobody working on guns before Newtown. It just wasn't an issue that anyone thought was particularly important. That, of course, all changed after Newtown, and eventually I really kind of stumbled into this issue entirely by accident and faced with this very challenge that you're describing. How do you continue to do work on an issue that is so structurally challenging, right? There's an amendment that creates challenges. There are structural challenges within the Senate that make progress very difficult. I'm, of course, talking about the filibuster, the overrepresentation of rural states. And then there's a very successful and powerful lobby that was able to take an issue and really generate an entire identity around it. So it's not just about the gun, it's everything the gun represents in terms of masculinity, in terms of racism, in terms of conservative values. And it's those are tough mountains to climb. And the way I kind of keep going and make sure that I'm not, kind of always in some fetal position crying somewhere is I actually do, Marcos, exactly what you do. Is I spend very little time following or reading the personal stories because that to me would just be incredibly difficult. And I actually find myself, even though I work on this issue so closely, I don't know a lot of the details, the kind of those dramatic details of the shootings. I don't know any of the shooters' names by design. And I just really try to focus on what strategy can I carve out? What political strategy, advocacy strategy can I carve out to make progress on this issue, to change the system that allows this kind of carnage to happen? Otherwise, I think, as you point out, it would just be too difficult.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Yeah, I'm actually kind of surprised to hear that, right? Because you think a gun control advocate is going to be deep into the nitty gritty, but it is so much, and it's sort of analogous to my coverage of the Ukraine war. It's one of my big focuses right now, and I've been covering the logistics and the mechanics of war, as opposed to the massacres, the war crimes, because once you start getting into that stuff, it's too much. It's too much, and then you're right.
And I don't think you know this, but I was born in Kiev and lived in Kiev for the first 5 years of my life. And so when the war actually started, not to derail us, but when the war actually started, I made a very conscious decision not to watch the cable news coverage of it because I didn't want to see the pictures, but to really only listen to the NPR, BBC, some of the Russian independent radio. And so I took a very similar page, I think, to what you were describing and to what I was just describing on the gun issue.
Yeah, you have to modulate, regulate, because again, it's dark. It's dark material, but it also has become background noise in a lot of ways. And it wasn't even the murders in Buffalo, I think, were sort of fading and had become background noise. And it took like a Newtown sort of situation where you have young children being massacred in large numbers to sort of jolt people back into action. And so that has to be frustrating from you. I saw, unfortunately I don't have it in front of me, but you wrote a tweet saying between Buffalo and between Uvalde, there was a large number of mass gun shootings in the country that completely, not only had gone under the radar, totally went under the radar. Nobody knows these existed except people directly in those impacted communities. So again, this is a situation where you're trying to get people to care about something that is incredibly important, but absent extreme tragedy, it doesn't get a lot of attention, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't, and that's the challenge, is that outside of an event that absolutely dominates the headlines, you kind of feel like you're screaming into the wilderness. And to me, moments like Uvalde are so important because they underscore and frankly demand leadership that is missing on this issue almost in all other days of the year. And what I mean by that is, we have leaders, President Biden, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who promise us when they need our votes that they will prioritize gun violence prevention, that they will fight to make progress. Yet when they have the power to move the ball down the court, to change the script on this issue, they choose not to. And to me, Marcos, over the last couple of days, that has been the source of such incredible and deep frustration. Because at this point, I don't care what you have to say. We don't need you to console the nation every single time. I mean, it's nice. But what we would like, and I think what the American people would like, and certainly the survivors all across the country to whom you made these promises, Mr. President, what they would like is a clear and tangible plan of what you will do to help make progress on this issue. And the fact that the White House has chosen to cast this president as a simple bystander who's completely outsourced the work of making a legislative deal or doing things through executive action to other people, and instead have decided that he's best as some cheerleader asking others to act or explaining to reporters all the things he can't do, to me is frankly a real shame. And I know that certainly many of the survivors who I work with every single day, to whom the president, again, made personal commitments, are incredibly frustrated that he hasn't, for instance, opened a White House office of gun violence prevention, that there isn't a single senior staffer in the White House whose sole job is to focus on this issue. Not one, by the way, not one. And that he chose after these twin shootings not to outline tangible steps that he would be taking to help us build safer communities, that he allowed Congress to leave on a 2-week vacation rather than bring them all in and use those 30 years you remember this 30 years of experience he told us he had of bringing Democrats and Republicans to get big things done. None of that matters anymore. None of that apparently was real when it comes to this issue. And I'll say one other thing, then I'll end rant here, is what is most shocking to me in this moment is that other voices in my movement and other voices in the broader progressive movement don't expect him to do more, that he gets a complete pass for not having any kind of plan, for not having any kind of vision or any kind of strategy as Americans are dying, as kids are dying. And I think it's very unique to this issue. That if we had a foreign attack of some sort, if there was something happening suddenly with climate, you would expect this president to actually do things as opposed to just say things.
Baby formula, right?
Yeah, baby formula is a perfect example. And the problem is there's just no muscle memory on this issue. There's no muscle memory of what action actually looks like. And what I've been arguing for the last couple of weeks is it's his responsibility to change that script and create that kind of muscle memory.
So Igor, I know you're sensitive to electoral considerations, right? I know you're not divorced from electoral realities, right? So the counter argument would be that the gun issue motivates conservatives to turn out, while the progressive liberal base has never been electorally motivated by this issue. So by creating an office of, gun policy, whatever it might be called, by creating that, they would be giving ammunition to Fox News and the crazy, sphere, the right wing sphere. But because of the filibuster and because of the Supreme Court, there's really not a lot of tangible things that can actually be done. So politically, electorally, it hits you, when from a policy standpoint, there's not a lot to work with. How would you respond to that?
And that's exactly, I think, what the White House believes, is that if he leans too heavily into this issue, as you point out, he will animate the other side, and that will produce electoral losses in the midterm. And what I submit is that if a politician cannot take 90% support for background checks, it's a little small for assault weapons, but it's all around there, 90, 80%, and cannot translate that support into tangible political pressure, then maybe that's not a very good politician.
Isn't that the story of the Democratic Party? Well, on immigration, on guns.
And I take the point that there are structural challenges, and I'm not suggesting any of this is easy, and I'm not saying that if the president, as I'm urging him to do, travels the country to impacted communities and tries to apply that pressure to key senators, that he would somehow overcome the filibuster, or that he would somehow convince Republicans who've built an entire identity over making it easier for people to kill each other, right? That's the brand. I'm not suggesting that, but what I am saying is, if the problem we're trying to solve for is, how is it that all of these Americans, so many more Americans, want to see background checks and we still don't have it? Why is that? I submit to you that part of the reason is because our leaders, or Democratic leaders, fail to fight every single time. They simply do not, they choose not to put up a fight on this issue. Because imagine if this president, the vice president, his cabinet barnstormed the country, made their case for why we need legislation to tighten our gun laws, for why we need to invest in the communities closest to the pain of everyday gun violence, and used all of that 30 years of experience to try to bring folks together and get something really tangible done in the Senate, some real movement in the Senate. They may fail. Absolutely, they may fail. But then they can turn around to voters and say, we tried. Here's the contrast. We are fighting for your lives. These guys are literally pumping guns into your communities. I need you to vote for us so that next time we can get this across the finish line after November. That, to me, is a much more compelling argument for why voters need to vote on this issue, and actually meets voters where they are, as opposed to the current argument, which is, it's just too hard. I know you elected us to do tough things, but it's hard. Look at Mitch McConnell. He won't agree with, that to me is not motivating anybody, and that only perpetuates this cycle.
I don't know. Mitch McConnell's interested in looking at school doors. There might
Right.
be some new school door policy coming out that might do something. So it's interesting to me. The numbers are clear, right? Americans do strongly support sensible restrictions on gun ownership. A plain reading of the Constitution says well regulated, right? I mean, this should not be controversial. Obviously, we have a Supreme Court that is out of control, radicalized, and unaccountable. But I don't think people really feel safer if they go to Walmart and there's some a-hole walking around with a freaking AR-15. I don't think people feel safer, and I actually know this because I'm Salvadoran and I grew up in El Salvador and I visit regularly, and gun there's a lot of guns floating around in the streets, right? Every store has a person in front with a rifle, a guard with a rifle. I mean, crime is so rampant that everybody has to carry, and it doesn't add to any feeling of safety. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And I would argue that crime is rampant because of the easy access to weapons because of the 10-year civil war back in the 80s. So do you have any sense? Do people actually want these Proud Boy type assholes walking around with rifles around their children? Is that something that anybody really is excited about?
So you look at polling, and you don't get the sense that people want the Proud Boys running around with firearms, but you do get the very clear sense that people believe that having a gun in the home helps protect them and their family. They don't think that your neighbor having a gun necessarily increases safety.
Right.
But me having a gun, that will do it. And we know that the truth here is something entirely different, that the research is conclusive that bringing a firearm into your home triples the risk of suicide, doubles the risk of homicide, that you are far more likely to use that gun against yourself or others than you are to use it against an intruder into your house. The number of defensive uses of guns, as opposed when compared with all kinds of different gun deaths, the contrast there is just striking. But it's hard to counteract that emotional sense that a firearm provides safety with data and numbers, and that never works, right? Even though the science is pretty clear. But it's also the case that this feeling that I'm describing that Americans have is relatively new. This wasn't the case 30, 40, 50 years ago. When people really felt like, firearms are innately dangerous in almost anybody's hands, right? We look at, for instance, our current conversation about police, right? The most trained in our society to use firearms. You look at, for instance, the rates at which they hit their intended target. I mean, they're dramatic. They're shockingly low.
No, people don't realize it's hard to actually hit something.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
not that easy.
Exactly. And so the fact that attitudes changed historically, which was the result of NRA propaganda, of the work that gun manufacturers did, of what we saw on our television screens during both Iraq wars, by the way, that in fact had a big impact on the kinds of guns that gun manufacturers started marketing to civilians. We saw many more assault weapons in the aftermath of the Iraq invasion in 2002, 2003. And so it gives me hope that we can change attitudes back to what they were, so they actually reflect the science on this point. But it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of work from our political leaders to stop talking about responsible gun owners, which I would argue is a very racist construct, but we can come back to that. And start talking about the innate danger of firearms in almost anyone's hands, right? Sounds radical in today's politics. We need cultural leaders to do the same, because that at the core, Marcos, you're getting at the very challenge of our issue, is that people believe they need the guns. When COVID hit, they ran out and they purchased guns in droves. And so, figuring out how you untangle that, I think will go a long way towards shifting attitudes, cultural attitudes, and making progress on this issue.
So let's actually talk a little bit about more, because you talk about the cultural aspect, and I think you're 100% right that this is no longer a policy debate, and
Mm.
it hasn't been for a while. This is now a core identity. The conservative movement has made belief in God, in guns, and Donald Trump, I guess, whatever. There's very few core beliefs left, and gun ownership becomes a really solid part of that. So when you talk about changing culturally, that cultural perception, do you have anything tangible that could start addressing that?
Yeah. So this is a really big question in the movement, and I should just back up and say that there's actual research here that looked at how NRA magazines and other kinds of NRA communications talked about the gun issue to their members. And the language they used wasn't how, progressives or you and I would talk about a policy, which is like this provision and that provision and this percentage decrease and that percentage decrease, and this is how safer it would be. Right? They used all of these terms that wrap the issue in the American flag. Defined gun owners as kind of the most patriotic people in the country, and those who oppose gun ownership as like these crazy lefty communist, etc. And that kind of conversation, right, happened over the course of decades and really got us into a place where folks tune out that kind of policy talk and just embrace this identity language. So I'm just trying to say that this was a systematic decision. It was a decision that they implemented over a series of years to create the very, to create the space where, identity is so much harder to chip away than some kind of policy preference. And so when you ask about, well, how do you tangibly begin to push away from that? Part of what you have to do, part of what we have to do, or gun violence prevention advocates, is figure out how to create an identity around safety, right? So folks know there's an organization called Moms Demand Action, right? That's an effort to imbue this side of the issue with a parental identity, right? To say that being a mother means you support tighter gun laws, you think guns should be locked up if you have them in the house, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's also some work being done in the movement that really tries to push younger folks, particularly in the teenage years, to start thinking about guns differently, to start pushing entertainment companies and content creators to tell different stories about firearm ownership. So ending this idea that a gun makes you more of a man, or that a gun is the way you protect yourself and your family, and telling stories that actually reflect the real experiences that people have with firearms that are not nearly as romantic as those tropes would have you believe. So those are, I think, that I think moves us in the right direction. But it's not easy, and there's no kind of magic light switch to make it all go away. It's going to require a willingness to tackle the danger of firearms head on. And to really think about how do you communicate that in a values, emotional driven way to your audience.
Yeah, it's interesting, because immediately when you talked, when you said that, I thought Hollywood, right, and Die Hard, and just a glorification of weapons. And I'm not gonna lie, those are like my favorite movies. John Wick, right? Like I love John Wick.
Die Hard 3 is the best, by the way.
So, but then you look, Japan gets to see Die Hard 3 and John Wick, and I mean this is, again, it really sort of is centered on our own specific circumstances. And Joe Biden was, said, like, I was on a plane and I just realized nobody else has this. I don't know if he really had just realized that. I hope he knew already. But what is that unique special sauce that makes us so susceptible to this when the rest of the industrialized world doesn't have to
Look,
deal with it?
I'm not suggesting that entertainment and
I didn't think you were,
yeah, yeah,
but I inserted
yeah,
this.
right,
Not
and
you.
Bruce Willis and Jeremy Irons, great combination for that movie, by the way. That they're somehow responsible because we know the research says that's not the case, right? And we know internationally, folks watch that movie in Japan, and the homicide rates in Japan are like 5 a year, right? So,
Yep.
so you have to look at what are other reasons. And Marcos, it's hard to escape the unique American history that is built on conquest of other people, of land, that brought guns into that history that first subjugated Native Americans and then used the firearm to subjugate Africans, who, of course, were brought here as slaves, who then used the firearm to push westward to obliterate entire indigenous communities. It was during this time, particularly in the 1850s and 60s, that firearms first became kind of mass produced and really sold in a much larger way. And some of the early American manufacturers recognized very quickly that there's real power in wrapping the firearm in this notion of manifest destiny as the country expanded westward. In this sense of, particularly as we saw urbanization in the early 1900s, of defining the firearm owner as the individual who will protect you from those immigrants who are going to, attack you and get you killed.
So rugged too, very
Yeah,
rugged.
right. Yeah. That rugged individuality, right, that the American myth is based on. Manufacturers realized early on, their marketing departments did, that they can sell more guns if they imbued their sales pitches with that kind of imagery, with that kind of mythology. And they did so deliberately over the course of decades and decades. And so I think you combine that kind of marketing with our history, and you begin to see, and you can bring it up all the way to through the civil rights movement, and how and the Jim Crow era before that, and how firearms were used to subjugate African Americans quite brutally as they fought for power. There's a great book, by the way, called The Second, that really tells the racial history of the Second Amendment.
Yeah, Elie Mystal was on last week, and he talked about how the Second Amendment really was to suppress slave rebellions.
Yes,
That was the core. That's what motivated Southerners to insert that in the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, so the history is a bit more complicated than that, but yes, there was certainly a contingent. There's certainly a contingent. I will complicate anything. There's certainly a contingent that really, for whom this was incredibly important, right? And who thought that only the militias had to be armed in order to put down slave rebellions, and who really feared that if you had some kind of standing army, that they simply wouldn't work hard enough. So yes, absolutely. And so anyway, so that's part of that history. And so I think that when you look at, well, what makes America unique, it's those pieces, and you fast forward all the way to modern day, and I think you quickly recognize that even still, here we are in 2022, you cannot divorce firearm ownership, particularly for people for whom this is a political identity, from notions of masculinity, from notions of white power, from notions of, well, I guess those two, right, and gun ownership. And it's almost like a braid that is all braided together. And until we can figure out as a movement, as a country, of how do you begin to separate those different notions, we are really going to have that challenge. And I submit to you that I think other nations, you look at Australia, you look at New Zealand, that so successfully were able to reduce gun violence with some real stringent reforms. They didn't, or at least maybe had the political will to overcome similar historical challenges. And here they're still, they're still very strong. They pull
Yeah,
it.
one of the really interesting phenomenons that I believe it's very unique to this country is this notion that, okay, like you said, people may want to have that one handgun in their home that makes them feel safe, right? But there are people who buy more, they buy multiple guns. They build entire arsenals. Do you have a sense what drives that? And clearly in a lot of these militia circles, right? But what drives that desire to buy more? And it's almost a cultural imperative. The more guns you have, the more American, the more conservative you are.
Yeah,
And of course, the gun companies love that.
Well, the gun companies love that and encourage that behavior, right? There's an entire community that encourages you to buy, right? Yeah, that encourages you to buy the newest gun. Gun manufacturers very actively market to that community. They're a big part of the market. It's part of that culture. And I think a lot of it, frankly, is really a political statement. A political statement of, oh, yeah, you want to come take my guns? Here they all are. I think that's fairly deliberate. And so, and then the other piece of it, I think part of what the NRA was so good at early on, and you may remember this, that in the early 1990s, the NRA really invested a lot in trying to attract government separatists into their organization. They advertised in their magazines. They went to their conferences. These are obviously folks who, wanted to separate from America in some way, or to overthrow the government in some way. Right? Some things actually don't change, and they really inserted, to a large degree, into the conservative identity, this idea of insurrection. And this idea that the Second Amendment supported the idea of insurrection. And so part of it is that. Part of it is having firearms in order to protect yourself from a tyrannical government. And that's an attitude that the NRA encouraged very heavily. And I would argue is in many ways the created the ideological bedrock for the insurrection that we saw on January 6th.
Yeah, no, very much so. And I always found that to be a little bit hilarious, considering that if you have a government with actual war-making capabilities, right? These yahoos with AR-15s wouldn't last very long in an actual real rebellion. But it's this sort of myth building. It's their Wolverines fantasy, the cheesy 80s movie with Patrick Swayze fending off the Cuban invaders in a small Colorado town. But it all, definitely feeds into that. So you talk about the NRA, and the subtitle to your book was How to Defeat the NRA. Can we defeat the NRA?
Look, I certainly think I get asked this a lot. It's like, Igor, you wrote a book about how to defeat them. So what do we do? I certainly think, and since I wrote the book, that the NRA is probably weaker now than it ever was in terms of, publicly they've been embarrassed by scandal after scandal after scandal. First, this whole thing with Maria Butina, which was an effort by the Russian government to kind of create greater divisions within American politics by exploiting the gun issue that the NRA kind of got sucked into, knowingly or not knowingly, is something folks argue about. There's all this corruption that leaked out in the way that Wayne LaPierre, the head of the NRA, really just milks the organization to fund his lavish lifestyle. It just reinforces for me that the way rich people stay rich is they just keep on spending other people's money. Because you read some of the stuff that came out in the investigations and the court cases, and and
he's still there, right?
He's still there. He just got reelected. Yeah, so he ain't leaving. And all of that, I think, is causes some embarrassment and creates, I think, some weakness in terms of how they're perceived publicly, how they're perceived in the mainstream. But at the same time, we are an incredibly divided country, to state the very obvious. And the NRA thrives in that kind of division where they can create an entirely different fact pattern. Um, and they also, I think, thrive from the fact that, yes, they're the largest lobby in this space, but there are all kinds of other groups on the state level and the federal level that are oftentimes actually to the right of the NRA. So one clear example now would be, the NRA will tell you publicly that they support some measure of red flag law, which is this legislation that would allow a court to take guns from individuals who are deemed a threat to themselves or others. The NRA will publicly say they support some version of that measure. 19 states and DC have it currently. But there are other groups who say that even that's too far, that's too much of a slippery slope. And so they operate in an ecosystem where there are a lot of loud, pretty radical voices, and they operate within a much larger conservative movement for whom guns is a top issue. Who vote on guns with or without the NRA, or with the NRA being this powerful or the NRA being that powerful. Right. And the great contrast is that doesn't hold true on our side, right? If you ask a progressive, name your top 5 issues that make you a progressive, I bet you guns isn't in the top 5 for most people you ask.
And everybody you ask will have a different 5. Everybody you ask.
Or we'll have a different 5, exactly. You ask a conservative, they are definitely in the top 5. And so, the NRA power can wane and grow. But the fact that they, by design, through a guy named Harlan Carter, who really created the modern NRA, by design, really planted the gun issue within the very center of the conservative identity. It guaranteed, obviously for generations, that this issue ain't going away.
And we don't have that figure. And just to sort of hammer that point, if you ask conservatives, all conservatives, what their top 5 issues are, you're going to get guns, abortion, lower taxes will be in every single one of them's top 5 list. Mm-hmm. Then to not to belabor the point, but liberals don't have that, and it partly it's because we're more diverse. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We don't all look the same. We're not all white men, Southerners. And so it's a lot easier for them to hone in on those specific issues, and they've been able to use it. And I always wonder what would have happened if the tobacco lobby had been as smart as the gun lobby had been, and turned the Marlboro Man into that cultural signifier for a conservative, and you're not going to take away my cigarette, right? Yeah. I mean, there's an alternate reality where they could have pulled that off, and they just didn't realize.
Well, and they almost did. We in the 90s, as a country, not you and me, but as a country, were able to begin to make progress against gun manufacturers in terms of changing the way they create their product through litigation, following the tobacco model. However, and I'm sure listeners know this, in 2006, I always screw this up, 2005 or 2006, the Bush administration pushed through Congress legislation that protects gun manufacturers and dealers and importers from almost any kind of liability. So that is preventing individuals harmed by guns from suing gun manufacturers, and thus created a shield where manufacturers can produce incredibly dangerous weapons. And by the way, that increases every year. The weapons actually get more dangerous. And they're not held accountable. There are no consequences for them, like there were for the tobacco companies. And so that's another, real substantial hurdle in making progress.
So, you talk about George Bush, and if we talk about the Supreme Court, obviously elections are a big part of this, and voting, and they're able to vote on this, and it's a huge advantage in able to push this agenda because the ballot box actually matters. And we are facing a November election where historically the party in power is less activated, hoping it's not the case this year. but it's going to be either way. It's going to be a bit of a dogfight, and if we lose control of Congress, then none of this is. It's just going to get worse. I mean, it's not even a question of can we make things better. It's going to get worse. So it's really important for people to turn out and vote. But is there anything within the current constraints of our political system that might actually help the situation better?
Yes, I'm so
okay.
glad you asked. Yes, and but I'll add, before I tell you, I will add to your litany of very intimidating problems that we also are awaiting a decision from the Supreme
Yes.
Court that could very much expand the meaning of the Second Amendment, could allow more firearms into public spaces without restrictions and regulation, which of course would then lead to more gun deaths. That's an incredible challenge to the movement, and we'll find out kind of where that stands in a couple of days and weeks. And so the question, though, is given these obstacles, these grand obstacles of the court, the filibuster, this cultural identity, what can we do, right? How can we continue to fight for our lives? And the good news is, as I see it, is there's really no reason to reinvent the wheel here. That what we've learned from successful movements in America, whether they be the civil rights movement or the marriage equality movement, or to some degree the climate and immigration movements, is they very strategically thought about who are other powerful non-political voices that we can pull into our cause, who are able to reach different audiences, who are able to push people in a different kind of apolitical way, often cultural way. And maybe we could use those voices, given the inaction on the federal level, we can use them to make progress. And the voices that have often, and this is just the reality, have helped us get to where we're going are business voices, are corporate voices. And you'll remember that early on in the fight for marriage equality, there was a real concerted effort to organize LGBTQ employees at large corporations for them to push their employers to start offering benefits to same-sex couples and folks in civil unions. And that really opened up a conversation about that issue in a way that we simply hadn't heard before, that you begin to really hear businesses making a business case for why offering benefits to same-sex partners was important to them, how it was able to grow the economy, for instance, how it was able to build and improve their business. And it kind of chipped away at the kind of conversations we were having about the cultural divisions. Right? Certainly your co-host knows so much about this, Carrie.
Yeah.
So
she says hi, by the way. I'm sorry she couldn't make it.
And so, what we at Guns Down America, the organization I lead, try to do is replicate some of that success. So a clear example would be in Buffalo, you had a shooting at a grocery store, right? Tops. It reminds all of us that businesses with storefronts, grocery stores, are oftentimes at the front line of America's gun crisis, right? And we ran some numbers and found out that between January 2020 through the Tops shooting, May 14th, in that window, and a window when a lot of us were at home because of COVID, you had over 448 gun incidents in or around major grocery stores all across the country. That is mind-boggling, right? And so that tells us that because stores have to deal with our epidemic of gun violence, because you can imagine businesses having to increase costs on insurance, on retaining employees, not to mention what it does to customers coming into your business, particularly in areas that have high rates of gun violence. They are they are facing this problem every single day. And I would argue they have to be part of the solution. And we as customers of those stores have to push them to be part of those solutions. So then why is it that some of our largest grocery chains across the country, why do they still give money to NRA-backed lawmakers who just make the problem worse? Why aren't they deliberately and strategically investing in community violence intervention programs in their communities that can successfully identify the small number of individuals responsible for most of the gun violence, everyday gun violence in an urban area, and offer them services that cause them to change their decisions, offer them opportunities that reduce homicides in communities? Why aren't these stores and these businesses using their clout, both publicly and privately, to lobby for systemic change on this issue? They should be part of the solution, and we, as customers of all of these brands, should push them to do that, right? Because they operate under different incentives than our political actors. And I think, all this frustration we have of it never changes, it never changes, it never changes. Yes, I am also frustrated. It is incredibly challenging. But what I'm arguing is that if you channel all of that rage into pushing voices that could be doing so much more, we could actually transform this entire debate in the same way that we saw great transformation around marriage equality, in the same way that we've been able to make progress on climate, where businesses now understand that if they don't deal with the consequences of climate change, they're screwed moving into the future. And so I think that's what gives me hope.
That sounds amazing. So how can people help you work on this mission?
Sure.
How can people participate?
Yes, please go to gunsdownamerica.org. There you will see the very campaign I described, the deadliest places to buy groceries in America.
Walmart, right?
Well, Walmart, Walmart, given its size and presence, is number one on that list.
But I think it speaks to your point, though, where these are companies with huge political clout.
Exactly, huge political clout and real trendsetters in the industry. We ran a campaign right after the El Paso shooting at Walmart in 2019, ran a campaign in a huge coalition that pushed Walmart to back away from gun sales, that pushed Walmart to reconsider its political giving. And we're really successful in getting the store to meet some of those objectives. So, it really suggests to me that there's a growing appetite and that there's a growing understanding from businesses that customers expect them to mirror their values, number one, and number two, and especially for young people for whom this is a settled issue. I think they very much understand the longevity of the brand demands that they fall on the right side of this public health crisis. So folks should go to gunsdownamerica.org for more information about how they can get involved to support the work that we do. Because, I always say great things take a great deal of work, and certainly it cannot be done without all of you.
Amen. Igor Volsky, he is the executive director of Guns Down America. You just saw that passion that I talked about. I didn't oversell what Igor brings to the table on this incredibly important but difficult issue. So Igor, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
That's the show for today. As always, remember, we have an election coming in November. It is the most important election in our lifetime. I know it's a cliche. I know we say that every time, but it's true. It's just as true as it was the last time we said it was the most important election of our lifetime. Our very democracy, our rights that we cherish, are on the ballot. So please, please, please work as hard as you can. Get everybody involved, engaged, interested in the election. Midterm elections are elections based on voter intensity, how much people care. And we have to care more than Republicans. We have to. We don't have a choice. So thank you so much for joining me, for being part of that solution. Thanks to Igor for talking about this critically important gun issue. It's a tough one, But I have to say, his solution of engaging corporate America in fighting that cultural battle, like the gay rights movement did and the climate change movement is doing right now, it makes a lot of sense, because we can't depend on our political system until we fix that, and we can't fix that until we win a clear majority in the Senate, hold the House, and make sure that a Republican doesn't take the White House in 2 years. Thanks so much to everybody that makes the brief possible behind the scenes. Walter, the producer, Walter, and Kara, and Dorothy, and Paul, and so many people that make it happen at Daily Kos. Thanks to everybody, and thanks to you for joining in, being part of the brief, joining me every week. Thanks so much. See you next week.